The all-new Toyota RAV4 asks, what if? What if your ride was refined and rugged at the same time? Introducing the all-new RAV4 Hybrid. 208 combined horsepower and standard all-wheel drive make it the most powerful RAV4. Plus, with its head-turning style and breakaway speed, it's bound to change the way you think of a hybrid. The all-new RAV4 Hybrid. Toyota. Let's go places. Horsepower. Ratings achieved using the required premium unleaded gasoline with an octane rating of 91 or higher. Premium fuel is not used. Performance will decrease.
Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about a topic near and dear to, I think, many of our hearts. It is the unique pain of infertility and why it's so hard to cope. Fascinating discussion about research that's specific to the type of grief that infertility leaves us with and forces us to cope with. I think you're really going to enjoy this. I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm the director of Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility and Adoption Education and Support nonprofit, and you can find us online at creatingafamily.org. We primarily keep in touch with our audience and our community through our weekly e-newsletters. We have two of them, one for infertility, one for adoption, and you can choose which or both that you want to receive. In our newsletters, we talk about the upcoming week's blog and show topics. Gives you an opportunity to submit questions if you have questions for the experts for that show. We also talk about any new resources that we've added to the site that week, and we add usually about 4, sometimes 5 resources every week. And we talk about what's happening here and what's happening in the world of infertility or adoption. So do us a favor. You can sign up. It's easy. Top right corner of any page of our website, creatingafamily.org. Just sign up. Free, easy, you should do it. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. Ferring has a free program that they want you to know about. It's called My Fertility Navigator. This program offers free and, most important, one-on-one support, live support for women who are struggling to get pregnant and are really unsure of what to do, their next step, and need information. You enroll in the program, My Fertility Navigator, and then you receive a personalized navigator, live guidance from a dedicated person who could provide you general information about fertility and infertility, as well as helping you find a nearby fertility center, helping provide information about financial resources to pay for fertility treatment and things such as that. You can get more information at their website, which is myfertilitynav.com/CAF. So I'm going to say that again, myfertilitynav.com/CAF. Check it out. It's good. I think you're going to really like that. This show, as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, could not and would not happen without the generous support from our partners who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support to those who are struggling to create a family. One of our great sponsors is Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey. They are a recognized scientific and patient care leader in the field of infertility. They have 10 offices and 21 physicians throughout New Jersey, and they maintain an IVF delivery rate well above the national average. And they offer the latest and validated technical solutions to help hopeful parents increase their chances for success in the shortest time possible. You can go to our website, hover over the word infertility, click on Find a Professional, and you will be taken directly to all of our partners, including Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey. Today, we're going to be talking about the unique pain of infertility and what it is about that makes it so hard for us to cope. Our guests today are Dr. Ken Doka. He is a professor at the College of New Rochelle, a senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America, and the author of Disenfranchised Grief, which is a book that specifically deals with the type of grief that infertility is. We also have Kris Faasse. Kris happens to be the director of adoption for Bethany Christian Services, but she is also a counselor, and she has spent many years counseling people who have come to adoption from infertility and are still dealing with the grief of infertility and miscarriages. This was a show we first did a number of years ago, and it has been a go-to show for me. I continue to come back to this show and recommend it, continue to listen to it myself, and also recommend it to others who are struggling, because I found it fascinating. I found the information fascinating, and I think you will as well. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Dr. Doka and Kris Faasse, to Creating a Family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dawn.
I am really looking forward to this show, Dr. Doka. I have read a lot of your stuff and have been a fan. So this is a real treat for me. In fact, Kris and I have talked before about your work. So I think it's maybe a treat for both of us. You refer to
well,
infertility.
I'm honored to be on.
Thanks. You refer to infertility grief as disenfranchised grief. What do you mean by that term?
Well, the term disenfranchised grief really refers to losses that others don't acknowledge. So you have a loss, but others don't acknowledge that grief. It's really not expressed. Fundamentally, what it means is you do not have a right to grieve that loss.
Yeah, that is such a issue with infertility, is people's inability or feeling that they don't have the right to mourn. I've also heard the term ambiguous loss used to describe infertility grief. Is that something different?
It's slightly different. It's a term by Pauline Boss, a very interesting, a very good term, written in her book entitled Ambiguous Loss. And what Dr. Boss is talking about there are losses that are that others are not really sure whether you've had a loss or not. And certainly infertility would fit into that as well. So, for example, the classic example of ambiguous loss would be if somebody has someone they love go missing. So you don't know if they're alive, if they're dead, if they've run away, if they're in trouble. You don't really know what's going on. But in some ways, infertility can also be an ambiguous loss because some people may feel it's just your lifestyle choice, and and they may not be aware of the efforts you're making to start a family.
Well, there's something also too that's about infertility, is that you're grieving a dream, not the reality, and that makes it so hard to deal with, both personally as well as for society to deal with. So how does that fit in, the idea that it's your dream that you've had that's not coming to fruition?
Yeah, and I think that it's one of the hidden losses of adulthood, because often the markers when we meet other adults are often do you have kids? What age are the kids? And that's one of the ways we connect with people. I often say that job loss and infertility are two of the real significant losses because they're both markers in conversations.
Oh, wow, that is so true. And so that means it comes up all the time, because when you meet somebody for the first time, you're just trying to establish a connection, trying to figure out where you fit and where they fit in the conversation. So you often will say, "What do you do?" Or, "Do you have children?" Yeah. So it's almost as if an added whammy to not only do you not have the ability to mourn it, and not only or the right to mourn it, and that it's not even a loss that's necessarily recognized. It's also a loss that is brought up just as part of standard conversation. I like that, as a marker in conversation, so that just what's a standard thing that we do highlights this grief. Oh, it's like it's a triple whammy, I guess, then, so to speak.
Yeah, and sometimes even a quadruple one, because cultures differ, and but in some cultures you're really expected to have children.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and
so
yeah.
Be fruitful and multiply, and if you're and if you don't have children, that that in some cultures that also creates a sort of cultural sanction.
Yeah, well, and that's not just abroad. I think there are familial cultures who also, you don't really enter into adulthood until you become a parent in your parents' mind or in your grandparents' mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right. It makes it, and then to throw that on top, and then it makes it even all the more, if people don't even recognize it as a loss, then you're really struggling to cope because you have no support. What is it from, and you've done so much research in general on grief, what is it about the ability to mourn that helps us resolve our grief, or does it?
Well, I think resolve is probably not one of my favorite words here. Because,
nor mine, actually. I hate the word.
Yeah, because I think you live with loss, and I think it peaks at different points. So, for example, when my grandchild was born, one of the things that I missed was being able to share that with my dad, who had died a little bit prior to that. So we live with losses, and he had died actually many years before. But I'm just saying that, we live with loss. We don't necessarily resolve it, but I think that support, gives us an opportunity to address our losses, to share our losses with other people, and for a lot of people, that kind of support, just the validation that this is a tough loss, and you're going through a hard time. Can be very important.
Is there something with if I think about our mourning rituals that we have, and I think all cultures and all families have mourning rituals, it seems to me that one of the purposes of the mourning ritual is to bring solace to the people who are mourning. Is there something about mourning communally that is helpful?
Oh, I think definitely so. I mean, I think you look at it, historically, and what we see, well predating our ability to write about it, was we see in various in Neolithic humans, we see that they took great care to follow certain kinds of rituals, to have ways to publicly mourn. They returned to the same places. We see by how they buried people that that certain objects were ritualistically placed with the person. So we see Louis Mumford says that cemeteries are the first permanent human settlements, and he's right on that. That we see that. So I think we've always found solace in mourning with others.
And with losses that you've studied, such as infertility, is the inability to communally grieve is that a hindrance to people living with their loss?
I think whenever we see any form of disenfranchised grief where there's not support, there's not validation, there's not ritual, there's not acknowledgement, I think it does complicate the grieving process. Okay,
I think so. Kris, I am going to be getting to you. We are going to be shifting the discussion in just a bit to talking about how infertility interferes with adoption, and we've got a number of questions that I want to, from both our audience and from me. But before we get to that, I wanted to just focus a little more on exclusively the infertility loss with you, Dr. Doka. We received an email question from Bethany, and she said, "We haven't shared our infertility with many people because we are private people, and also because we don't think that they will understand. It might impact me at work, too, because I don't want them knowing that I'll be taking a lot of time off for treatments. As a result, we suffer in silence. I don't know if this is making it harder for us, but we are both having a really hard time. Any suggestions would be greatly appreciated." Any thoughts on that, Dr. Doka?
Well, it certainly is. It kind of illustrates what we've been talking about. And my only suggestion at this point in time is that, is if she doesn't have a confidant, that she can really talk about her, the grief, the experience they're having about this loss, the difficulty, the way it's affecting their relationship, then I would strongly suggest that she might want to go find a counselor who specializes in infertility or specializes in grief to really address those issues. These are very normal struggles. Children have a lot of meaning to us. Symbolically, as you said, it's a dream. I always tell my class, many of us have chosen names for our children when we're children ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We may
That's so
change
true.
those names, but we often think about, how many children I'm going to have and what do I want them to be, and so there really are a lot of losses and a lot of issues, and when families are struggling with infertility, there may be a lot of tension, and sometimes we get counseling on the medical aspects of infertility, but we really may need counseling on the psychological aspects of infertility as well.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. We do have resources at Creating a Family on how to find a therapist that specializes in infertility because I think it's helpful to have somebody who has a clue. You are listening to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and infertility. Today we're going to be talking about coming to terms with infertility grief. We primarily keep in touch with our audience through our twice-weekly e-newsletter. We let you know about the latest developments in infertility and adoption, as well as the upcoming week's blog and show topic. Please sign up for our weekly newsletter at creatingafamily.org. It's on the top left-hand side, I believe. One of the things that we hear a lot about, we run an online support group, and one of the things we hear a lot about from people who are struggling with infertility is what I think of as triggering events of sadness caused by things such as the pregnancy of a good friend or a family member, attending a baby shower, or even just receiving the invitations to a baby shower. And quite frankly, what's relevant this week, and we're hearing about it quite a bit, is going to family functions such as Thanksgiving dinner. It tends to make your childlessness even more painful. And how do people, what do you suggest for these type of events that you, for whatever reason, do trigger, and yet you don't particularly want to remove yourself from life?
Yeah, and I think that's, that's, again, what I want to do is validate how normal that is. If you remember what I talked about earlier, I talked about how certain events that take place even years after a loss can trigger grief. So for instance, it may be that, that your dad died 20 years ago and now you're walking down the aisle and no matter who's holding your arm, whether it's a brother or a grandfather or an uncle or your mother or somebody else, you're still feeling the loss of your father very profoundly at that moment. And I think the same thing happens when you're struggling with infertility. All of these become triggers to grief. The baby showers, the birth announcements, the invitations, and even going to a Thanksgiving dinner or a holiday dinner where you're seeing lots of kids running around and people inevitably turn to you and say, what about you? When are you going to have kids? When are you going to start your family? Can be extraordinarily painful. What I always tell people to do in those situations is to, first of all, really kind of choose, what are the events I want to, first of all, to validate your grief, to recognize these are triggers, and then a second thing is to make choices of what's really healthy for you. And then third, I think it's useful to have responses, to the painful questions that you may get asked, and almost so you can. Erin Lynn does something with insensitive questions about grief, and what she says is always do it with three things. In other words, why does the question hurt? And the question hurts like when are you going to have a family? Because the answer is you don't know. You're trying very hard. It's something you've wished for. And so it really accentuates your grief. And then I think the second question she asked is why do people ask that? And most of the time in situations like that, in grief, they don't do it particularly to hurt. They do it out of curiosity. They do it out of support. They do it out of making conversation. And then she says, think about how you might answer those questions, and sometimes in an educative role, we're not sure when we're having a family, but you'll be the first to know, or we'll let you know, or something like that when that's going to come about. It may be a deflective question. Again, depending on the relationship, depending on the honesty, you may answer it more confrontingly. But again, I think the two main lessons I'm trying to bring out are choose where you want to be and then be prepared when you're there.
Along those lines, we have done a number of top 10 answers. We've done both when are you going to have kids? We've done both a real version, and we've also done a snarky version. And I must say we've had great time with the PG-13 rated snarky version. Not that I'm encouraging people to actually use the snarky responses.
Yeah. But and there could be a third response, which is just deflecting. We don't know yet, but you'll be the first. We'll tell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's one of the real ones, as opposed to the snarky ones. Again, just to
I'd love to hear the snarky ones.
I have to. A couple of them are probably not appropriate for radio, but some are. I would have to try to remember some. I tell you what, I'll send you for everybody listening, I will post again the snarky answers. They came up. Our community, our online community, came up with them, and we had a huge response. And everybody had a ball coming up with of their own, and
and that's healthy too, because it's a way to get out some of the anger and resentment that these kinds of questions sometimes generate. So even if you don't say them, the thinking them might be fun.
Exactly. I think you are exactly right. Thinking them is fun, and you also feel the sense of being understood because the other people who are submitting them get it. And that raises a point that is something I think a lot about, because I do moderate an online support group, and it seems to me that there's a lot bad about the internet, and there's a lot bad about not bad, but it's a lot lacking in many ways about support groups that are exclusively online. But for many people, it is one of the best ways of finding a supportive network of people who are going through what you're going through or have been through what you are going through, and they get it. Have you seen that in other areas of disenfranchised grief, including infertility? That the advent of online support has made it easier for people in diverse locations to draw together. Is it to find?
I think that's one of the great advantages of the internet, is that it does allow for communities of like-minded people to get together and to find support and to reach people who also may like the anonymity that the internet accords.
Absolutely.
Of course, as you go into that, also recognize, and the other thing about the internet that's very useful is it allows what we call dosing. And in other words, if you go to a support group and you're sitting around with other people, there may come a point where you feel overwhelmed, and part of you wants to escape, and the other part thinks, well, it's really not fair. But in the internet, you kind of have that freedom to sort of read as much as you want until it becomes painful, or to stay in a chat room as long as you want. So it allows that dosing. Of course, the danger is that when you're on the internet, you want to be aware of that the anonymity also allows for, especially in an unregulated site, for sometimes false information to be shared, sometimes exploitive information to be shared, and sometimes for people to make hurtful comments. So, as long as you are aware of the dangers, I think the internet can be an incredible place for information and support.
It doesn't take the place of in-person support But often in the areas of infertility, and sometimes with adoption, and quite frankly with adoption as well, people outside of the very large metropolitan areas don't have the option of an in-person support group. And that's hard for people who live in a metropolitan area to realize, is that there are, and even quite frankly, many of the in-person support groups struggle. They struggle because they usually started by a single person, and when that person either moves on or just is weary of the role, it tends to flounder. So there are some wonderful exceptions to that, but I think that it certainly is it can be an ongoing problem. You're listening today to Creating a Family, and we're talking about coming to terms with infertility grief. Speaking of, actually, great segue here, that Creating a Family has the largest infertility and adoption communities on the social network, and we would love to have you join us. On Twitter, you can connect at Creating a Family. That's the word. On Facebook, the name. On Facebook, there are 3 different ways. One, you can like the Creating a Family Facebook page. You can also join the Creating a Family Facebook support group, which I was just mentioning. It is a closed group. However, if you request to admittance, I will see that, and we will let you join us. We would love to have you join us. You can also connect with me individually, Dawn.Davenport1. The easiest way to find either the Facebook page or the group would be to type in the words Creating a Family in the Facebook search box. Another question we sometimes get is it surrounds the different ways that males and females grieve in general and grieve infertility loss. It can sometimes cause problems in relationships. You have written some on the different ways that men and women grieve. How do you see it play out in the area of infertility or other ambiguous losses? Or disenfranchised grief?
Yeah, well, let me make one comment there, in that you're referring to the work that Terry Martin and I have done on grieving styles.
Right.
And one of the we started to do was to look at how men and women grieve differently. And what we realized is, that the answer to that is, unsurprisingly, more subtle and complex. So what we ended up doing was sort of moving away from gender to some degree, and talking about what we call grieving styles. Now, we see these grieving styles as related to gender, but not necessarily determined by gender. So
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah. So we see these grieving styles on a continuum. And one grieving style is more affectively oriented. People, when they experience grief, they tend to describe it as emotion. Their way of expressing it mirrors that. They cry, they get angry. And what usually helps is working through those feelings, exploring and working through those feelings. On the other end of the continuum are grievers that we call instrumental, who are much more apt to experience their grief cognitively or physically, and likely to do their grief. Now, there are people in the middle who are blended, and then there's another type of grieving style we call dissonant. Certainly, many men may have an instrumental style on the instrumental end of the continuum, but you'll see it work both ways. And the problems, of course, become when, let's say, you have one partner, let's say the woman, but it doesn't have to be, who's really just, experiencing tremendous emotion that's almost at this point in time that has to be worked through, and that's almost disempowering or disabling. That they're experiencing some intense sadness, maybe depression, and then you have another partner in the relationship who wants to deal with it by constantly problem solving. Let's do this. Let's try that. That's their way of dealing with grief. Let's consider this option. So again, it helps to be, what I would say, aware of how you approach and how you cope with grief, and I would say cope with life, really. That these styles are evident in other ways we cope with crisis, and to understand that that your way of experiencing it may not be the same as your partner's way of experiencing that.
And also to understand, it seems to me, that one way is not necessarily the better way.
No, we really make that point because, again, in the culture of counseling, we often look at the person who's able to express and experience emotion as being, the most desirable client, and
that is true.
They're differences; they're not deficiencies.
Yeah, that's a. I think that it's easier to help somebody who is actively describing and talking about and wants to talk about their feelings, but for the person who is the strong silent type, it feels like you're not being able to be effective in your helping. Another associated with infertility is also the issue of miscarriage, the inability to carry a child to term. And I think in our society seems to understand the grief associated with a late pregnancy loss, a stillbirth, but fails to grasp the grief over early pregnancy loss. And people on our groups and other places report being told by others, how common it is to have a miscarriage. You'll have better luck next time, and on, and not fully grasping all the work and dollars and fertility treatment and time that went into getting this one pregnancy test. Is it the role of the person suffering the loss to try to educate others in order to get more a sympathetic response, or should they just accept what feels like a very callous comment?
Well, again, I would go back to what Erin Lynn would say is that that's a choice you can make if you really feel you want to educate. So the person says to you, well, just go back and try again, and you can say, eventually we're going to plan to, but this has been very difficult for us, and it's really this loss really hurt us. So it depends on how much you want to do that. My sense is that we're much better on perinatal loss than we used to be, particularly late in pregnancy. But you can even sometimes earlier. But where we're not good is we focus only on the mothers, and pregnancy loss affects the entire family. And I think we have to acknowledge that husbands will also experience grief over pregnancy loss, and siblings will, and anybody in the family system might.
That's a very good point. And I do, and I think we're better at late-term losses versus early-term losses.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's been some pioneering work that was done by lots of people for about 40 years. When I first started in the field, pregnancy loss was almost totally negated and totally disenfranchised. Yeah.
Well, that's I guess something to be thankful for.
Yeah. I mean, you can almost cite when Mark started putting out cards.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought of that. Good point.
Well, there's actually a dissertation on that about how different grief has been recognized using the Hallmark catalog.
Yeah, because how Hallmark recognizes and approaches grief, and so what that's what the ultimate definer of what is a disenfranchised loss. Is there a Hallmark card for it? No. Well, then that's a pretty darn disenfranchised loss.
And that was a dissertation that came out, which was quite good.
Yeah, I bet it was. I'd like now to move into an area that it is a way that infertility grief lives on, and I see it, and I know Kris sees it, and that is how infertility grief interferes with or plays out in the adoption world. Not everyone who is infertile chooses to move to adoption, but many people who are infertile, who have not been successful with treatment, do move to adoption. I should also add that there are many people who adopt who have not experienced infertility, but again, if we're talking in generalities, I think the generalities would hold that many people who are now adoptive parents have also suffered through infertility. I'm going to start with a question from Elizabeth, and then and open up a discussion about how infertility loss affects adoption and adoptive parents and adoptive parenting. Elizabeth writes, I am a mom through adoption to two beautiful kids that I adore. I struggled for 8 years with infertility and the slow adoption process. I feel like I should be the happiest person in the world, and yet I still struggle with feelings of loss, jealousy, and others' pregnancies, and my longing to be pregnant. I thought adoption would cure me of all these feelings. I'd love to hear what your guests have to say about this. And God bless you in creating a family for what you do. You have been a ray of understanding and information in this long, long journey. Thank you, Elizabeth. Kris, how common is it, do you find, for people to be surprised that adoption has not, as she said, cured, and she did put it, I should say, in quotes, cured her infertility grief?
I think we do find it fairly commonly, Dawn, but I think also we try very hard in that pre-adoption education to start to prepare families for that and to really talk about the losses and how they grieve them. And it's so important to mark that and to acknowledge that loss, because until we acknowledge that there's a loss, we can't move through coming to that point of reconciliation or adaptation, to quote Dr. Warden, who's another one of my heroes in this whole area. You have to come to that place of acknowledging it's a loss, and so often families do come into adoption with the idea that this will cure that feeling of loss, when in fact there are losses that it doesn't come anywhere near that experience of pregnancy, that dreamed of child, the child who will look like me or have similarities to me. As one mom said to me, I'll never have the experience of having given birth and being wheeled out of the hospital with that baby in my arms. And there's even that loss of those, even if you adopt a newborn and that baby's placed with you at the hospital, there's still that loss of those first months. And again, the loss of not only the pregnancy, but the child's history and control over that. So there's myriad losses that are involved that unless we talk them through and give voice to them, and to go to what Dr. Doka was talking about, validate those are losses. Mm-hmm. And we allow the ability to talk through them, then we kind of shove them aside and think it's all going to be okay. But again, I think giving voice to that is so important.
You know, one of the things that I often speak to is the need, something that I see lacking in many ways through the infertility treatment, the whole journey, or what I call the escalator, the treatment escalator, is that need for a pause, to do exactly what you say, the need for a pause to be able to lick your wounds, so to speak, or to acknowledge, to acknowledge, especially I think this is the case when we move to either donor eggs, donor sperm, donor embryo, or adoption, into non-genetic parenting. The adoption process inherently gives us, when we're experiencing good pre-adoption education, what part of that is doing exactly what you're saying, Kris, and that is helping people and couples, women and couples, come to terms with that. But when the move goes towards donor gametes, egg or sperm, it's not inherent. There are many infertility clinics that immediately, well, all right, you've had your second IVF with your own egg fail. You know, let's go ahead and let's do donor egg on the next cycle. There may be nothing more than simply a month or 2 months, depending on the people's finances, before they then move into non-genetic parenting. Dr. Doka, I was wondering if you do you see that there is a need before one was to move? This may be a little out of your area of expertise because it is a more specific to infertility, but before one moves to third-party reproduction through donor egg, donor sperm, surrogacy, or donor embryo, is there a need to take stock, and say, okay, let me sit for a moment and grieve that my genetic child is, as Kris said, my dream child, my dreamed of child?
Yeah, and again, I think that would depend on the client, but I think that obviously at each step, it's good to reflect on, where you've been before you take. That's just good counseling to me. Before you start moving to the next step, and if there is a sense of loss, and many people there might be, to explore what you're hoping to gain from this, what you see is different. Yeah, I would think that counseling here, and that allows you to take stock, or even if you're able to sort of do this with your own reflective self-awareness, would be a very important process.
Yeah, and I should say that there are many clinics who do just that. They ask you to see a counselor, and usually this person is trained in infertility before moving to donor gametes or donor embryo. So I do think that there is certainly a recognition, at least by some in the infertility field. All right, we have another question that I'd like to read. This person has asked for me not to use their name. It is a woman. She says, I hate to admit this, but right now I don't really like my child. We adopted him 4 months ago, and he is very colicky and cries frequently. I find myself thinking that if he had been born to me, he wouldn't act like this. My grief over my inability to carry a baby to term and inability to afford more advanced treatments like surrogacy has really hit me the last couple of weeks. I am too ashamed to admit this to anyone, although I hinted at it on the Creating a Family group. The responses were helpful. I feel like such a freak and a total failure. Kris, what would you say to this mom? She's adopted, this is her first child, and he's 4 months old, and she adopted him at birth. And she's really being laid low right now with a new wave of grief, partly brought on by the fact that this child is a fussy baby.
Dawn, Dr. Karen Foley's done some wonderful research on this idea of depression after adoption. Her book is Post-Adoption Blues, and so much of that sense of depression and sense of sadness and being overwhelmed relates to the unmet expectations. And any new parent starts the journey of parenting with expectations and ideas and thoughts of what the future is going to be. We have this picture, and it's often very rosy. And when there's a dissonance with that expectation, moms and dads both are at risk to have a sense of depression, and that's certainly one thing I'd be suspicious of here. And it's just that unmet expectation. But families who go through the adoption process go through a laborious process in the home study. And they work very hard to convince their worker that we're going to be great parents and talk about cognitive dissonance. So I've been telling everybody I'll be a great parent. This is what I've wanted. Oh, my gosh, my expectation. This isn't what I thought it would be. And then I start beating up on myself. And again, I think so often families, when they do experience a dissonance with their expectation, don't dare talk to anybody about that. And so even that loss of their dream and their idea of how it would be becomes a loss that's disenfranchised in many ways. And I want to be conscious of not, making everything a significant loss, but I think for that new parent, that's a huge issue, or that can be a huge issue, and they don't tend to reach out. So for that mom, I would encourage her to find someone she trusts, whether it's a counselor, whether it's her worker. Her agency should be there ready to step up and say, let's get you some supports. And by the way, exhaustion doesn't help with a sense of depression either. So getting some supports in place can be huge. But it's not abnormal, and I want to normalize that.
And I think sometimes normalizing it is so powerful. I would also encourage people who are feeling thoughts that they feel no one else has ever felt. At least on our group, and I suspect on other groups, it is possible to submit your questions to me either through the easiest way is through the Facebook message system, and ask that they be posted anonymously if that would give you greater freedom to express your feelings. Many people do this, and when they do, they find out that what they're feeling, they're not the only ones who have felt that. Other people have felt that. They have gotten past it. They have come to the place where they now love their children and feel very competent as parents. Or they're in the middle of it right now, and sometimes, sharing the moment when you're in it with others who are in the moment can also be helpful. So there are definitely ways that you can reach out and get some help. Let me also say that we have interviewed, the book is Post-Adoption Blues. We have interviewed her on the Creating a Family show, and you can access that at our website. It was a great interview, and I recommend that you do. We've talked about, this is one way that, and I think you're probably right that there's certainly an issue of depression that might be playing out here. How else, Kris, have you seen the infertility infertility grief circle back and raise itself and somehow influence the adoption or the adoptive parent and child relationship?
We certainly see it early on, and we see that new parent, the mom or the dad or both of them, who have that overwhelming sadness, and they may not even realize why they're feeling sad. This is something they've worked for and wanted, and in fact, they may not have the social support because this is what they've worked for and wanted. So we see it early on, and that parent who's either feeling blue or even to the point of depression can't start to engage with that baby and that child in a way that builds those bonds of attachment. Mm-hmm. So we see it can interfere early, but even the parent who never really comes to that point of reconciliation, that I'm going to parent this child who was not born to me, but this is my child, and I'm going to bond and attach to that parent who's never gotten there, still it has this expectation of who that child will be and what they'll act like and how they'll behave. And again, we get dissonance sometimes between how can you be like this? This isn't how you're supposed to be. And we don't necessarily say that out loud, but that feeling is pervasive, that this is not what I expected of my child. And that can block that parent's ability to attach to the child. And finally, it's so not fair to a child to have to live up to this dreamed of child that they know nothing about. And even if they did, we want to accept children for who they are. So if I'm still holding on to some of those losses or the fantasy child and expecting somehow my child is going to meet that's just not fair to that child.
Yeah, amen. And although it does happen, it's important to realize that it certainly does happen with parents who have children by biology as well. Mm-hmm. In some ways, you feel less disloyal in that sense than you do, and you have with it in the adoption situation, you have an easy thing to point to. This would not be happening if this child had my genes. If this child was a child I had been dreaming of, we did and you can be much more forgiving of that child who's yours biologically. It would appear from the families I've worked with. That's interesting, yeah, and I think you're probably right. That would, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think, and it just so isn't fair to a child. And I often wonder that, especially when young children have been adopted, well, and older children as well, that when we are focusing on the child's attachment, one of our recurring themes here at Creating a Family is that attachment is a two-way street. It's not just the child that has to attach, it's also the parent that has to attach. And I like the thought that it's the unmet expectation. It's important to be aware of what our expectations were so that we can realize that part of our issue is an unmet expectation. I think that, well, maybe I should put that in a question format, I suppose. So if unmet expectations, if our commenter or questioner, if part of the issue is what her dreams had been like, and this is a disconnect from what she imagined, how can what are some ways to help move past this into a place where she can more fully appreciate this child for whom he is? And Kris, I'm sorry, I'm directing that to you. I apologize.
No problem. I think it goes back to either with a counselor or through self-reflection, but really getting in touch with and acknowledging what were those losses, because when we start to say, what did I lose with this? I know what I gained, but there was another side to the coin. What did I lose? And I start to look at what those were, and I can start to frame them, either verbally or even in thinking through them, through my thoughts. I start to think about what my losses were, and then I can start to think, well, how did that impact what I expected this would be like? And when we know, wow, I expected it would be all smiles and laughter and great, and it wasn't like that, but this is real life. I think it's easier to then get in touch with, but what is real life? You know, we talk about with marriage, the end of the emotional honeymoon. We usually have thought through, well, it's not always going to be the honeymoon. And we have a certain tolerance for that. And it's kind of doing that with what our expectations were of parenting.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it just helps to, the conversations we have with a variety of parents, as you say, I think almost every parent goes through that at some point in time. This was, because we all have these expectations of being perfect parents with perfect kids.
Yeah, exactly, and that good combination that both we were going to be perfect and our kids would be, if not perfect, at least easier than they are. Right. I've noticed that we have, that I use the word resolve, and Dr. Doka, you had said you dislike the word resolve, and so do I. Because resolve makes it seem like it's a package that you tie up and you put, you finish it all up, tie it up, put it up on the shelf, and be done with it. And I noticed that when Kris was talking, she talked about the word adapt to. So what I'd like to focus on now is what are some ways that people can, whatever the term we want to use, come to terms with, resolve, which we don't particularly like, adapt to, move along with, incorporate into, whatever the correct, whatever term you want to use, a grief that people, that our society doesn't recognize, that we may not have given ourselves permission to recognize. And in particular, what I'm asking is some ways that people can, some steps that people can take for those who are moving into adoption or non-genetic parenting, so that we are in a better place to not do, as Kris says, it's so unfair to the child for us not to have worked this through. Dr. Doka, I'd like to start with you on that, and then Kris, please chime in as well.
Okay, and I think it's in some ways a very hard question, because I think with every couple the answer may be different. But the questions I think I would ask in counseling is what are some of the, as you move, to really do some work with them on what they, on what they felt they've let go in this process, what they feel they're gaining in this process. I'd like to review the decisions that they've made and any reactions, thoughts, emotions attached to those. Certainly, I would say, if there's a lot that's going on, and this was a very difficult decision, wrought with conflicting thoughts, wrought with conflicting emotions, is there anything we need to do? Is there, I once did a ritual where people sort of, almost had a mourning ritual, a funeral for their, with a few close friends, a ritual where they said, okay, we're mourning the fact that we cannot do this, and then, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to recognize that, and we need to get support from the people who could support us, and then we're ready to move on, and to go with and to explore other alternatives. So I think it really is a kind of mourning process, and you cited Bill Warden, who's also one of my favorite people in terms of his work, and to really acknowledge that grieving involves a whole number of tasks, and it's acknowledging the loss, it's dealing with the emotions, it's adjusting to a life in face of the loss, it's dealing with any spiritual issues associated with that, and then it's saying, okay, and how do I fit this in as I continue with my life? How do I relocate that loss? How do I make adjustments? So it really is allowing people to go through a mourning process as they move on to the next area.
I think the importance of ritual is wonderful. We did a show with Carol Lieber-Wilkins this summer, Coping with Infertility Grief After Adopting, and she talked about the need for ritualizing perhaps not a funeral per se, but she suggested a beautiful ritual where you would write a letter to the child, your dreamed of child, and then set that letter free. And I certainly heard of people planting a tree or doing something, but somehow doing something concrete, communally if possible, is powerful. And actually, after that show, somebody from had heard the show and did the ritual, and it was so powerful. And she wrote about it in such a really beautiful way. I linked to her blog, so you can find go back at the Creating a Family group. I believe, that's where I linked to it. It was just beautiful. And it helped her, and it helped she and her husband move past that the intensity of the grief. Kris, what about you? Any thoughts on what we can do there with to help us adapt better and become better parents to the children who are our real kids, not our dreamed of children?
Right. Well, and I think certainly everything Dr. Doka said, and really exploring what the loss means. What am I losing? And you may not have all of it, and there are triggers and other things will make you think of it. It doesn't mean you haven't worked through, but there will always be triggers, and I think Dr. Doka talked about that earlier, that memory of, I wish someone was here. So acknowledging the losses, giving voice to them, journaling if you're a journaler. But I want to echo the importance of ritual because it marks the transition. It says this matters. And I think that's such a powerful and important message. And we talk about rituals when there's an adoptive placement, and it's the same concept. It's so important to both that birth family, the placing family, and the adopting family to have a ritual that marks the transition and says, this is important stuff. And so that birth family is entrusting their child to the love and the care of the adoptive family. And that's very entitling and empowering for that adoptive family as well. But again, it's the importance of ritual. So finding ways to have ritual, accepting the intense emotions, whatever that might be. And they're different for different people and different with different losses. So acknowledging the emotions, and eventually the energy you're putting into it dissipates, and you get to that point where you can move forward to the next step and come to that place of adaptation or reconciliation with the loss, which doesn't mean it wasn't a loss. It just means I've put that in a place, I've redefined myself, and I can move to another place.
Kris, I'm going to give you our last question, and maybe an unfair one to end on because it's rather open-ended, but, you're up for it. How do we know when your grief is still too raw that you shouldn't move on to adoption, that you're really and I know this is one that as both a counselor and a social worker, it's heartbreaking because you don't want to have to acknowledge that. But how do we know when it's time, when it really isn't, that you're really not ready?
I think when that family is still, or that person is still experiencing intense emotion consistently, they're preoccupy their thoughts, or they're finding they're triggered almost continually. Something is making them think of the loss or bringing out the emotions. Any of those intense reactions to loss say to me they're not moving through the grieving process to the point where they can redefine themselves, put that loss in a special place in their heart, and move forward. So I'd be looking at the intensity of emotion and the frequency of the intense emotions.
All right. So that you kind of, in general, it would be that it's the degree that you would be looking at. Okay.
Yeah,
well, go ahead, Dr. Doka, please.
I would just add, is their grief really disabling them? Is it really inhibiting them from functioning in key roles?
Okay, So again, looking at the effect of the grief as well as the intensity, and being honest with yourself, which is of course hard because people at this point have reached it where they're at the point where they just want a child. Give me a child. That's what I want. And giving them permission that yes, that may be coming, but right now honor where you're at before you take the next step, as hard as it might well be.
But Dawn, that's a wonderful term. Honor where you're at. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to take a moment to thank a few more of our gold sponsors and to remind you that it is through their generous support that we can bring you this show and all the resources at Creating a Family. We have Fairfax Cryobank. Fairfax has been a leader in sperm donation for over 20 years and is dedicated to supplying updated, verified, and accurate medical and personal information on their donors. We also have Children's Connection. They're an adoption agency with offices throughout Texas, providing domestic infant adoption, embryo donation adoption, home studies, and post-adoption support to families throughout the United States, and independent adoption centers whose mission is to provide open adoption placement and counseling to birth and adoptive families. They work with families in all 50 states. Let me take just a quick moment to thank you both for being our guests today on Creating a Family. And I'm sure that people are going to want more information on each of you. And let's see, I had both of your websites popped up, and I did. Dr. Doka, could you give us? I think it's drkendoka.com. Is that it?
Yeah, www.drkendoka.com. One word.
And Kris, at Bethany, I've actually now pulled it up here. It's you can reach Kris at Bethany, which is Bethany.org, a very easy one to remember. And I thank you, Dr. Doka, for saying yours. Thank you again for being my guest today. This is a topic of such importance and of real relevance to our audience. And to the audience, let me say thanks for joining us, and I will see you next week.
Now at the Home Depot, save up to 35% off appliance special buys, like the Samsung stainless steel side-by-side refrigerator, just $9.98. You save $300. It's big enough to hold 25 bags of groceries. Unload those, and if that makes you thirsty, you'll really love the external ice maker and water dispenser. Today is the day for doing. Spring Black Friday savings now at the Home Depot. More saving, more doing. U.S. only while supplies last. See store for details. Valid through April 17th.